Computer programs need to interact with users either by getting data from the user or displaying some kind of results. We have already seen how to display output to the user using the print function. In this video, you will learn how to obtain input from the user using Python's input function. We can get data to our programs from many different sources, such as files, sensors, and network sockets. Similarly, data produced by a program or the output can be either displayed to a screen, saved to a file, or sent down a network link. A basic mechanism for getting input data and communicating output to the user is through standard input and output. In most programming environment, the default input device is the keyboard, and the default output device is the screen. And in Python, you have two built-in functions which allows you to communicate with standard input and output devices. So the input function is used for getting input from the keyboard, and the print function is used for displaying output to the screen. One of the simplest ways to obtain input from the keyboard in Python is by using the input function. The syntax of the input function is shown in this slide, and the input function takes one optional parameter, and this parameter is usually a string parameter. So most of the time you will pass a string argument to the input function, and it is an optional argument, so you could call the input function without actually passing it any arguments. And the way you know that the parameter is optional or not is by because of these square brackets. So these square brackets basically indicate that my parameter is optional. So I could call the input function without passing it anything. So I could call it, for example, by just simply typing input in Python. However, you wouldn't be doing this most of the time, because the argument that we usually pass to the input function is the prompt, and a prompt is basically a message which is displayed by the program to ask the user for input. So the way we usually use the input function is by typing the word input and opening parentheses and giving it a string message. For example, a message that tells the user enter your name. And the way this line is executed is basically when it is run by the Python interpreter, it will display a message to the user, and that message will say enter your name. And the Python program will stop waiting for the user to type something in the keyboard, and then when the user hits the enter key, anything that has been entered by the user, it will be read and it will be returned by this function as a string. So this function basically returns a string value or a string object. And what you would want to do most of the time is to take everything that is returned by this function and save it in a variable. So for example, if the user types their name and they hit enter, I would want to save this in a variable, and I might call that variable name, and then later on I can use this variable in other statements. So to see how the input function works in Python, let's take a look at a quick demo. So to demonstrate the input function, I'll start by using it in its simplest form. And the simplest way to use the input function is basically to type the input function and you don't give it any arguments. So if you type input with open and closing parentheses with no arguments at all, and you hit enter, this is what happens. So as you can see, it seems that the interpreter is waiting for something. So you see this blinking cursor and nothing is coming out. So what's happening right now is that the program is waiting for us to type something, to provide some input to the program. And it will keep waiting until we type something and then hit enter. We can just simply hit enter, and in this case we don't provide any input to the program. So let me just type the numbers 5000 and hit enter. Now the program comes back with a string containing 5000. So what happened is this: we called the input function in our program, and then the Python interpreter took this function and executed it. And because the input function always stops the program and waits for the user to type something, and what I have typed at the end of the day is the string 5000. And remember, the input function always returns a string. So it took this 5000 and returned it back to the interactive shell. So remember that we are working with the interactive shell, and in the interactive shell, whatever value that you type is always printed as it is. So you remember from the previous discussion, if I type the number 20, what I get here in the output is the number 20. The same thing has happened here. So the value that we have got for the input function is the value 5000, and this is the string 5000 and not the number 5000, and that number has been eventually displayed in here. So calling the input function without passing it any arguments is not really that useful, because a user will not know exactly what to do when he doesn't get any information about what to do next. So usually we will prompt the user to provide input for us, and the way we do that is by passing a string argument to the input function. So for example, I instruct the user to enter, and let's go with the same example that we have seen previously. Enter your name, and then when you hit enter, now you get a message. So the Python interpreter displays a message, and the message that gets displayed is the same thing that you put between the double quotations here. So the message is telling the user to enter a name. So let's enter some name. So for example, Joe Jack, and when you hit enter, the terminal now displays Joe Jack. So the value of this function, or the value returned by this function, is whatever the user has typed. Let me run the same function again, and if I type whatever you type in here, it's going to be basically displayed as it is. So let's just write 5000, you get the string 5000. Now this is not the way we usually use the input function, because you get input because you want some data for your program to process, and what we need to do is we need to store this input in some kind of a variable. So what I will do here is, most of the time I will write a variable, and whatever I get from the input function, I will assign it to this variable. Now when you hit enter, again it is asking you to enter some name. So I'll type Jack. Now I'm not getting any output from the shell. The reason is I'm not getting any output because this information that I have typed is now stored inside this variable name. So if I type name, which is the variable where the information is stored, I get back the value Jack. Now when we use input, we don't usually write input functions in the interactive shells. The input function is very useful when you are writing scripts that obtain information from the user. So let me write a very simple program, and this simple program will basically greet a user once they type their name. So I'll use the same statement that I have written in here. So let me take this thing, copy paste it, and put it down here. So this is what will happen. So take, say, the name of the user and save it inside the name variable. And then let's say we print a greeting message for the user. So we'll say hello and then I'll pass to my print function the name which I have obtained from this statement. So whatever you type in here, whatever you type in the input, that will be saved inside the variable called name, and that variable called name I will display it in the second line. So let's run this program, and now if you type the some name, for example Jack, it says hello Jack. And if you run it again, if you say 5000, it says hello 5000. So the input function always returns a string. And one question is, how do we deal with numeric data, or how do we deal with numbers? And let's say that you want to build a very simple calculator, and this calculator asks the user to enter an integer and then divides that integer by 2. Now we'll talk about this division operator in more details in the next section of this lecture when we talk about expressions, but these two slashes mean the division operator, or the floor division operator. So this program asks the user for a number and then divides it by 2, and it displays the result. So let's try and run this program and see what happens. So it's asking me to enter an integer. Let me enter the value 702 and hit enter. Now what we get this kind of error. So this is a semantic error, and it's basically telling us that if you read the message, unsupported operand types for the slashes, str and int. So what is happening here is we are basically trying to take a string. So remember, the input function returns a string, and we are trying to take a string, and that string we are trying to divide it by an integer, which is 2. And you cannot divide a string by the integer 2. So the question is, what do we do in this case? What we need to do is basically to convert this input into an appropriate data type, and that appropriate data type in this case is an integer. And if you remember from our discussion in the previous section of this lecture, we use the integer conversion function to do that. So if I want to take the input and I want to change it into int, I will use the int function, and that int function will pass, or will take, whatever given to me by the input function, and it will convert it into an integer. And this should be able to do the trick. So I should be getting an integer here, and I should be able to divide it by 2. So if we run this again, so let's run it again. Now if I enter 702, so the number divided by 2 is 351. And you can try it with other numbers. So for example, if I do take 101 divided by 2 is 50. So that's it for the input function. Now you know how to write programs that take strings or numbers as input data.